To bring the meeting to order. We're a little late. Sorry about that. There was an exciting meeting just before us, and I hope ours will be as exciting. Well, maybe not that exciting. I don't want all those reporters running after us. But yes, so we are carrying on with our study of Bill C-69, and we have quite a few witnesses in front of us. I always think guests, witnesses, the right word, experts. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'll just let the committee know who's with us. We have Nigel Banks, Professor of Faculty of Law, University of Calgary, and he's with us through video conference. So when we get to your witness statements, we'll probably start with you. Canada West Foundation, Colleen Collins, thank you very much for joining us. You are the Vice President in Research. We have Ecology Action Centre, Mark Butler. Just looking at Mark, thank you. And he's a Policy Director. And Lisa Mitchell. Where's Lisa? She's on the screen. That's good, letting us know where everyone is. Thank you. Executive Director and Senior Lawyer. And we have Pembina Institute, Duncan, and he's the Managing Director. And Nicole, now I'm very bad with names. Dusick. Thank you very much for that. I am. I'm really, listen, everyone has a weakness, right? I admit mine, okay? Postdoctoral Fellow with Federal Policy. Welcome to each of you, and we're very much looking forward to the discussions today. And we'll, just for a little bit of housekeeping, I don't like to interrupt people, my colleagues or our guests, so I'll hold up a yellow card when you have a 1 minute left in your statements. When a red card goes up, I don't mean for you just to stop in the middle of what you're saying, but I do want you to quickly wrap up because you are out of time. Okay? And then I will interrupt if I need to, but hopefully I won't need to. So we'll start with Mr. Banks, and you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee. And thank you also for accommodating my appearance via teleconference. So I'm a professor of law at the University of Calgary, where I teach, amongst other subjects, energy law. I also comment regularly on developments in energy law and policy on ABLog, which is the blog of the Faculty of Law. I appear this morning in my personal capacity, and I also made a personal submission to the Energy Modernisation Panel. My submission principally focuses on Part 2 of Bill C-69, which, as you know, is concerned with the abolition of the National Energy Board and the creation of the new Canadian Energy Regulator. My written brief makes 6 main points. I think I've got time for 3 of those this morning. The first point that the bill needs to address, in my view, is the close connection between energy policy, greenhouse gas emissions, and Canada's climate change commitments. I think it's self-evident that there is a close connection between energy policy and climate policy, simply because the extraction, processing, production, transportation and consumption of carbon-based fuels results in emissions of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane. Part 1 of Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, addresses this connection in 2 linked provisions. Section 22, dealing with the content of an impact assessment, and Section 63, dealing with the final project decision to be made by the Minister or Governor in Council. There is no similar provision in Part 2 of Bill C-69, notwithstanding the interconnection between climate and energy issues. I think that this omission is especially significant when we consider that the CER will continue to perform the NEB's energy information function under Sections 80 to 86 of Part 2 of Bill C-69. As part of this function, we can anticipate that the CER will continue to prepare energy supply-demand forecasts for Canada. It's crucial that these forecasts should be informed and indeed constrained by Canada's climate change commitments, as well as relevant provincial commitments. Accordingly, I recommend that the committee consider proposing a series of amendments to Part 2 to recognise the connection between energy policy and climate policy, and I have 3 concrete proposals. First, Part 2 of the bill might include appropriate references to climate and energy policy in the Purpose section, Section 6, and the Mandate, Section 11 provision of the bill. Second, I think that Part 2 of the bill might borrow from the provisions of Part 1 of Bill C-69, which I've already mentioned, and list climate change obligations as a relevant consideration in considering new projects. And third, I propose a substantive provision that might be inserted immediately after the current Section 55. And this might read as follows: when making a decision, an order, or a recommendation under this Act, or in discharging its mandate under Sections 80 to 84, the Commission must consider the Government of Canada's ability to meet its environmental obligations and its commitments in respect of climate change. I'm now going to change direction a little and address two issues that relate to the transparency of the NEB's and the CER's processes and the resulting judicial supervision of these processes. And to do that, I need to make two background comments. And the first of those is that we find ourselves here today discussing Part 2 of this bill because the elected government concluded that Canadians had lost faith in the review system for energy projects. Accordingly, we should be checking to ensure that the procedures that are being proposed will help restore that faith. Second, the drafting of Part 2 of Bill C-69 exhibits, notwithstanding its huge length, a certain economy and approach. And what I mean by that is, notwithstanding the new name and the abolition of the NEB, much of this legislation is simply cut and pasted from the existing National Energy Board Act. One of the implications of this is that there are missed opportunities to improve the current approach. So I've now got then two substantive comments that I'll make following from those propositions. And the first of those is that the bill as drafted fails to clarify what's referred to as the exceptions process in the current Act. This is the process that allows the NEB to exempt projects from the requirements of the Act, including the requirements for a public hearing and the need to obtain a certificate of public convenience and necessity. While this seems fairly innocuous since it's confined to pipelines not exceeding 40 kilometres, it was also the process that was used in relation to the controversial Line 9 project, which involved the reversal of over 600 kilometres of the Enbridge line between Westover, near Hamilton, and Montreal, and a related expansion of throughput to allow oil sands product to reach further east. The exemption could be triggered because the project was largely using existing pipe and right-of-way. The difficulty with this current provision, which is Section 58, is that it is completely opaque from the outside. It fails to communicate to the public, including municipalities and others, just how this discretion will be exercised and what terms and conditions might be included as part of granting the exemption. Bill C-69 does nothing whatsoever to clarify this in what is now Section 214 of the bill, which is a copy of the current Section 58. Accordingly, I recommend that the committee might consider how the bill could be amended to provide more transparent direction to the CER in exercising this important discretionary power. One possible avenue to explore would be to require the CER to address its mind to all of the factors listed in Section 262, which is the list of relevant considerations for pipeline projects requiring a certificate. My next point and final point relates to another missed opportunity, and this time in the context of judicial supervision of the process. Under the current rules, decisions of both the NEB and the Governor in Council, where appropriate, can be appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal. The first step in this process is for an aggrieved party to file an application for leave to appeal with the Federal Court of Appeal. It's only if the court grants leave that a panel of the court will consider the merits of the appeal. By tradition, and I think it's no more than that, the Federal Court of Appeal does not provide reasons when it grants, or more commonly, denies an application for leave. As a result, unsuccessful applicants feel aggrieved when they are denied further access to the court without knowing the reasons. The City of Burnaby has recently experienced this in the context of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Once again, the current provisions are reproduced verbatim in Part 2 of Bill C-69, Section 72 and 188. In my view, this undermines the faith of the public in the integrity of the project review scheme in a most unfortunate and unnecessary way. Accordingly, I recommend that the committee should propose amendments to Bill C-69 to require the Federal Court of Appeal to provide reasons for its decision on leave applications under this Act. While I acknowledge that it is perhaps unusual to give this level of direction to a court, I think that if the court can't see the problem itself, then it needs some direction. I should say that other superior courts in Canada provide reasons in exercising their authority under similar leave applications. For example, the Alberta Court of Appeal routinely provides reasons on leave applications involving the Alberta Energy Regulator. So I make these last 2 points, the exception point and this point about reasons, in light of the concerns that are alleged to be driving this modernisation process. I think that each of these proposals will add transparency and accountability and hence improves the public's trust in the integrity of the process. And that concludes my remarks.
You do have a minute. I'm only putting up a yellow card, but if you're done.
I'm done, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Who would like to go next? Ms. Collins?
Yes.
Sure, thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and honourable committee members. I'm Colleen Collins, Vice President of the Canada West Foundation, an independent, nonpartisan public policy research organization with a Western Canadian perspective. Bill C-69 proposes to overhaul Canada's energy project assessment process, create a new impact assessment agency, and replace the National Energy Board with the Canadian Energy Regulator. Changes to the existing process are necessary to restore both public trust in the project approval system and the confidence of potential investors in the Canadian economy. We're pleased that the government has put forward a comprehensive vision for a process that is intended to increase transparency, fairness, and inclusiveness. However, it fails to address the implications of that process on trust, economic activity, and national competitiveness, the very reasons that drove the change in the first place. Proponents and investors are not worried about tough, evidence-based regulation. What discourages investment is decision-making that is vague, uncertain, and subject to politically motivated decisions at the end of a long and expensive process. Bill C-69 as proposed retains some of the same features that are causing problems in the current system. Most important, the bill continues to leave the political decision until after the end of the regulatory process. Without question, decisions about what is or is not in the national interest should be made by our elected leaders. That is the key to our democracy. However, those decisions need to be made up front, before the long and costly regulatory process begins. Bill C-69's proposed planning phase prior to the impact assessment provides an ideal window for this upfront political decision. The national interest decision should not be subject to changing political views during or after the process. We have seen political decisions undermine the credibility of the regulatory process. If the government does not trust the regulator to make fair, independent, evidence-based decisions, then why should Canadians and investors? There needs to be certainty during the long process of seeking regulatory approval. The goalposts will not change and that a new government will not overturn prior decisions and commitments. Bill C-69 further compounds this problem by removing the requirement for a decision by the regulator at the end of its assessment process. Currently, the regulator recommends to government whether or not it should approve a project or not. Bill C-69 does not extend this authority to the new IAA, and this is a mistake. The government's job is to put in place a framework for the regulatory process. Then it must let the regulator do its job. That job should go beyond communicating a project's impact, benefits, and mitigation. After examining the evidence presented, assessing and balancing positive and negative impacts, as well as potential mitigation, the regulator is in the best position to make an informed and impartial decision on whether or not the project should proceed. Another critical driver of uncertainty and lack of trust has been the shifting of the development of economic, Indigenous, and environmental policy onto the regulator. A regulatory process cannot and should not be expected to determine policy. Ongoing political debates about climate, energy, and Indigenous relations have found their way into NEB project hearings for lack of any other venue in which to resolve these issues. These policy debates are much broader than any specific project. The federal government must address broader policy questions before they encumber the regulatory process with issues beyond its scope. The combination of clear policy on relevant issues and a regulatory process that deals with project specifics is critical to improving both trust and the investment climate in Canada. A positive step forward is the shift to an assessment process that considers both the positive and negative impacts of a project, unlike the focus on negative impacts under the current system. In addition, including the formal recognition of health, social, and economic effects will also contribute to a more balanced assessment and a balanced public debate. The new regulator will also have to figure out how to deal with increased volume of participation in regulatory reviews stemming from the elimination of the established principle of standing. While obtaining input from a wide variety of people is a positive step, the regulator will need to establish a strong process to manage them. It should ensure that diverse voices are heard without the consultation itself becoming an impediment to good decision-making. It will need to ensure that the most relevant voices are not lost. And finally, whatever process is used, it must be clear to all that consultation does not mean veto power. Thank you.
Thank you. How about Mr. Butler? Do you want to go next?
Okay. We were going to start with Lisa.
Okay, that's fine. Lisa?
Good. Thank you. Good morning, Chair and committee members, and thank you for agreeing to hear from us today. I'm with the East Coast Environmental Law Association, an environmental law charity based in Halifax, and we work throughout Atlantic Canada, providing environmental law information, advice, and support. Over the past several months, we've been providing support to the Ecology Action Centre, and my colleague Mark Butler is with you today, and to the Offshore Alliance. Given the breadth of your review of Bill C-69, our focus today is very narrow. Our focus is on the role of the offshore energy regulators in impact assessment. So in particular, the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, which I'll refer to collectively as the petroleum boards. As you know, the petroleum boards are the regulatory bodies responsible for the development of oil and gas resources and the management of petroleum operations off the coasts of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. Currently, under SIA 2012, the petroleum boards do not conduct environmental assessments of designated activities. In this regard, they are treated differently than the other two energy regulators, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the National Energy Board. The NEB and the CNSC are responsible authorities under SIA 2012 with the power to conduct EAs of designated projects in combination with their own regulatory processes. Of course, this was not always the case. Prior to SIA 2012, the NEB and the CNSC did not conduct EA. The merging of project assessment processes and regulatory processes began under SIA 1992 through the substitution provisions and proceeded to be formalized for the NEB and the CNSC under SIA 2012. Those changes were made with the intent of streamlining project assessment. The federal government has stated an objective of regaining public trust in environmental assessment, and the appointment of the expert panel on EA reform was part of that objective, and the introduction of Bill C-69 is presumably the culmination of the government's efforts to achieve this objective. Perhaps in an effort to strike a balance, Bill C-69 requires all designated projects that include physical activities regulated by CNSC, the Canadian Energy Regulator, CER, and the petroleum boards to be referred to a review panel. This is a significant change for the NEB and the CNSC, reducing the role of those regulators in the assessment process and to some extent decoupling the assessment and regulatory processes. The assessment and regulatory processes are not entirely separated, as Section 51 of the Impact Assessment Act requires the review panels provide conclusions and recommendations to support the licensing and other processes under the Canadian Energy Regulator Act and the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. This is for the most part positive in that the planning or assessment process appears to be at the forefront with the role of informing the regulatory considerations. However, there could be more clarity provided in the Act to ensure that review panels under the Impact Assessment Act do not serve as regulatory hearing processes. Let me move to the petroleum boards. The proposed implementation of the Impact Assessment Act through Bill C-69 creates some confusion for those of us seeking to understand the role of the petroleum boards in impact assessments. As written, the IAA will treat the petroleum boards in a way that is different from the CER and the CNSC initially, but will subsequently be amended to treat all energy regulators in a similar manner. I'll base my comments on a presumption that the amendments will be passed, but I do seek clarification on why there are provisions of the bill specific to the petroleum boards that will come into force at a later date. In any case, once the amendments are in effect, the Impact Assessment Act will require referral to a review panel for designated activities that are regulated by the petroleum boards. We agree that a review panel should be established for major offshore activities, including exploration and extraction drilling. We also agree with the requirement that the review panel hold public hearings. As written, the review panel must include at a minimum 2 members of the petroleum board selected from a roster. We do not believe that it is in the best interest of the assessment process, communities, potentially impacted industries, or the environment to have regulators on the review panel. To that end, we would recommend that subsection 46.13 and subsection 48.13 be deleted. Regulators have an important role to play in providing expertise to the impact assessment process, and we support consultation and cooperation with the regulator as prescribed in Section 21 of the Impact Assessment Act. However, the assessment process should be conducted independently. Selection of review panel members should be done on a case-by-case basis, with the focus of ensuring that those selected have relevant expertise, local knowledge, no conflict of interest, etc. And limiting the role of the regulators in the assessment process to providing their input and expertise rather than full participation as panel members helps to protect the independence of the assessment process. I'd like to speak briefly about designated activities. Not all offshore activities are necessarily major energy projects that require a review panel, but many do require independent impact assessment. Under the Impact Assessment Act, energy projects are assessed by a review panel or they're not assessed at all. We're concerned that this means that designated activities will be limited to the worst of the worst. Let's take seismic surveys, for example. The negative impacts of seismic surveys on fish species and marine mammals is not well understood, but recent studies have indicated that seismic survey activities require more thorough scrutiny than they currently receive. We will recommend that seismic surveys be added to the list of designated activities to undergo federal impact assessment. However, there's no path currently in the Impact Assessment Act to assess these activities other than via a review panel. So we'd ask the committee to consider a revision to Bill C-69 to enable offshore activities that may not qualify as major energy projects to be subject to an independent impact assessment by the Impact Assessment Agency. I'm going to turn the rest of my time over to Mark Butler.
Okay, you have just over 3 minutes.
Thank you. Chair, members of Parliament, thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm the Policy Director at the Ecology Action Centre. Prior to working at EAC, which is some time ago, I worked in the fishing industry and as a marine consultant. EAC is a member of the Offshore Alliance, which is a newly formed coalition made up of environmental, fishing, community groups, as well as Indigenous spokespeople. Yesterday, Rod Northey from the EA panel presented. I thought the panel which he was part of did a good job of consulting with Canadians, including Indigenous peoples. I drove to Fredericton through the tail end of a hurricane to present on a more central role for science in impact assessment and on offshore regulation. I spend my precious minutes mentioning this because I was saddened by the lack of uptake by the government of the panel's report. If this becomes a pattern, it engenders cynicism and damages democracy. The EA panel, in their report, recognized the value in keeping EA and regulatory processes separate. The panel also recognized that a regulator can get too close to the industry it is regulating, creating regulatory capture, although they did not label it as such. Relevant quotes from the panel's report can be found in our written submission. When elected, the government promised to make EA credible again. Outside of the petroleum industry, the boards have a credibility problem. When these proposed changes were announced, the Chronicle Herald, which is a Nova Scotia newspaper, ran a cartoon showing the regulator looking through binoculars, which were actually oil barrels. Once again, cartoonist Bruce McKinnon said it all in one picture. Giving the boards more power, such as seats on review panels, was not what we expected, and is a step backwards for EA in Atlantic Canada. Before I close, a few words on the witness list. I truly appreciate the opportunity to present along with the East Coast Environmental Law Association today. However, I am concerned that the committee is not hearing from any representatives from the fishing industry in Nova Scotia. As we saw in the Gulf of Mexico and elsewhere, a major blowout or spill can have a devastating impact on the fishing industry and other industries such as tourism. It is not just the direct impact on fish stocks or beaches that affects these industries. It is the damage to the product or brand as a result of the spill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just to be clear, we did invite over 150 groups to present briefs, so not everybody has a chance to sit in front of the committee, but the briefs are coming through translation right now, and so we will be considering those briefs that have come in. Thank you. Okay, next up, who would like to start?
I'll start. Yeah, good.
Please, thank you. Floor is yours.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. Thank you very much for allowing us to present today on Pembina's Institute's recommendations for Bill C-69. My name is Duncan Kenyon, and I am the director of Pembina Institute's work on responsible fossil fuels. I'm here with my colleague, Nicole Dusick, who is a postdoctoral fellow with Pembina Institute. The Pembina Institute is a national non-partisan non-profit think tank that has over 30 years of experience providing research and recommendations to inform energy policy and regulations in Canada. We have been actively engaged in the environmental law reform process for the past 2 years, and our submission to the Energy and NEB Expert Panel report entitled Good Governance in the Low Carbon Era was based on original research that involved interviewing 23 experts from around Canada and the world. Our comments today are largely based on that research. And in fact, as energy nerds, it's always a good day when we get to share our perspective on energy policy with decision makers. Our involvement to date has focused on mobilizing the National Energy Board, and our comments today will continue in that vein. We will focus our comments on Part 2 of the bill pertaining to the Canadian Energy Regulator. We believe that the Canadian Energy Regulator Act is a good piece of legislation that will move us toward more credible review processes. It is clear that the government is aware of major issues that have been identified with the NEB and is seeking substantial reform that will address many of those issues. In particular, we support the revised governance regime for the CER, the transfer of authority for impact assessment to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, the expanded list of factors that must be considered when issuing a certificate or authorizations, the removal of standing tests for public participation, and the emphasis on partnering with Indigenous groups and jurisdictions. However, the Act contains significant omissions that will need to be addressed if it is to achieve its intended purpose of providing credible, evidence-based project reviews and ultimately restoring public trust in the federal energy regulatory process. In our testimony today, we will address 4 issues: climate change, the composition of review panels, public participation, and energy data. We ask you to refer to our written statement for additional recommendations to strengthen on the accountability and transparency of CER decision-making, ensuring the CER is diverse and has a range of competencies, and tightening up the conflict of interest provisions. Our first recommendation is to include climate considerations. Similarly to Nigel's discussion on that, the CER Act makes no reference to climate policy, commitments, or impacts. In fact, the word climate does not occur once in the entire Act. This is a major omission. If the economy and the environment are to go hand in hand, the federal energy regulator must have the mandate to integrate climate considerations throughout its activities and functions. This includes the climate impacts of energy infrastructure, but also the financial and physical risks that climate change poses to energy infrastructure. We recommend that including climate considerations in the purpose of the Act, the reporting and advising responsibilities of the regulator, and the factors considered in issuing a certificate or authorization under the Act. Our second recommendation is to limit CER representation on project review panels. We strongly support transferring the responsibility for impact assessment to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Having a single agency responsible for conducting all assessments under the Impact Assessment Act will help ensure consistent application of the law for all sectors and projects. We recognize that the specific expertise that a life cycle regulator, of the life cycle regulators, and feel is acceptable that the CER and other life cycle regulators have a seat on review panels. In fact, that's critical. It is not acceptable, however, that they potentially comprise a majority or the entirety of an impact assessment review panel. The existing wording of the Impact Assessment Act allows for this possibility and must be amended to ensure the project review panels have balanced representation and expertise, including representation from relevant regions. We recommend amending Section 47.3 in the Impact Assessment Act to limit CER representation to 1 of 3 seats. Our third recommendation is to provide specific mechanisms to ensure meaningful public participation. We are very pleased to see the removal of the standing test for public participation. While the intent of the bill is clear, removing barriers to participation is not enough to ensure the public has a real voice in major energy projects. The practical need for improving public participation in the assessment of major projects has been noted by the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, as well as both the expert review panels. We are past the point of acknowledging the need for public and community engagement. We need to make this happen. This requires explicit and careful design from the outset and throughout project life cycles. We believe the best way to ensure this happens is to create a public intervener office, as recommended by the NEB expert panel, to ensure meaningful public engagement. We recommend creating a public intervener office to advise on public engagement activities, ensure public access and representation throughout the project life cycles. We also recommend making participant funding program. We also recommend making the participant funding program mandatory. Our final recommendation is to create an independent energy agency. We were disappointed to see no specific provisions in the Canadian Energy Regulator Act to improve the state of energy information in Canada or to ensure the federal energy regulation is based on high-quality, independent data and analysis. The expert panel on NEB modernization stated, "We feel that the new Canadian Energy Information Agency needs to have the mandate and ability to tell it like it is on energy matters and inform the development of energy policy and strategy without being involved in the determination of energy policy or administrating energy infrastructure regulation. This will help to ensure this information is seen as neutral and credible." We strongly agree with that statement. We recommend amendments that would enable and fund the creation of a new Canadian Energy Information Agency and expand energy data collection at Statistics Canada. In addition, we recommend that the new agency be tasked with producing annual scenarios for energy supply and demand, including a reference case that considers domestic and international action on climate change. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and we welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to thank all of you for very detailed briefs and statements today. Lots of good ideas there, or ideas for sure. Want to recognize a new member at the table. We have an MP, Dave Van Kesteren. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we'll start questions with Mr. Will Amos.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
What was that? Well, I'm trying. I'm working on it.
I hope this isn't eating into my time.
Nope.
Thank you to our witnesses, both video and live. It's clear that you've invested significant time in your presentations. We all know how much you have focused on this issue for the last couple of years. We take that very seriously. Professor Banks, I've read with great interest for many years your commentary on the energy governance in Canada and on impact assessment. I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment further on sustainability and regional impact assessments. You've written on this topic in the past, and I'd like to know a bit more about what you think where this legislation hits the mark, and more particularly where it misses it and how it can be fixed.
Thank you, Mr. Ramos. I think it's a positive step to see that both the IAA panels and the CER are directed to take into account strategic assessments and the like. And I as you know, have written on the importance of engaging in strategic environmental assessments. So I think that there is an integration here. I also think that, if I recall correctly, there is a provision that allows a party to direct them or to inquire of the minister to establish a strategic environmental assessment for a particular type of issue, and that the minister is required to provide a written response to that. So all of that seems to me to be positive in terms of these two bills.
Okay. The comment was raised earlier by Mr. Butler that there's a major debate that is particularly happening out on the East Coast. I'd say that's where I'm hearing it the most, around the appropriate role for the regulator in the context of an impact assessment panel. I think, in fact, Mr. Butler's opinion is one that I share, which is that that there's an appropriate role, and that it would be important to have a regulator on a panel, but that having a majority of seats on a panel would not be appropriate. What is your opinion on that matter?
I guess my opinion, certainly in relation to the CER, which I thought more about than the offshore boards, is that I would agree with Mr. Kenyon's comments from Pembina that it's important to have that CER involvement because of the knowledge base that it brings, and because it will be the life cycle regulator for a project if approved. But I'd also support Mr. Kenyon's comments that it shouldn't be a majority. It's an interest and an expertise that's necessary. But I think the whole idea of this is that it not be a dominant consideration.
Thank you. Moving now to the issue of the appropriate role of the judiciary and other dispute settlement entities that could be contemplated in the context of this bill. The panel came with recommendations suggesting that a quasi-judicial entity was important, but this bill doesn't follow that path. Previous witnesses before our committee have discussed this issue, including Mr. Northey yesterday and Mr. Olsinski, your colleague, the day before. Do you have opinions in relation to the appropriate role of a non-court entity, some kind of specialized tribunal, to deal with disputes that arise in the context of this? We also have, of course, the Cabinet's role, which is integrated into this discussion. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Okay, so I've made one comment, of course, in my brief and remarks this morning about requiring the Federal Court of Appeal to provide reasons to support its decisions. But you're asking me much more, I think, about the creation of an environmental court or an environmental appeal board as a part of a supervisory scheme. I guess my own view is that I really see the value of EABs, that sort of body, in the context of reviewing decisions made by departments rather than by quasi-judicial bodies. So I've written in the past about the way in which EABs can shed light on internal decision-making within departments. I don't see that as being necessary in the context of either panels or in the context of the CER. That is, I think what I want is reasoned decisions and no undue deference to decisions made by the governing council or the minister.
Thank you for that. A very quick follow-up then. So if an environmental appeals board type of entity you don't think is appropriate in this particular scheme, what do you think is the appropriate role for cabinet in this?
Well, I am of the view that the final go, no-go decisions in relation to projects are political decisions and are therefore appropriately made at either the ministerial or the cabinet level. But I'm also of the view that those decisions too need to provide appropriately detailed reasons which themselves would be subject to review by a court.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Fast.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. There was only one witness that actually addressed the issue of competitiveness, the ability of our natural resource sector to actually compete within the global marketplace, and that was Ms. Collins. So thank you for doing that. That is critical. Canada is a rich country in terms of natural resources. The price we get for those resources is dependent upon certainty and upon the competitiveness of the playing field on which Canada competes internationally. Now, you mentioned, Ms. Collins, that the decision as to what is and what is not in the national interest should be made by political players, which I think has been repeated here at this table a few times. Now, when did you suggest that that decision should be made? Was it the planning process itself or later?
The opportunity is the planning process. So the decision at the end of the planning process is the national interest decision. That's the time for the political decision.
Did I hear you say that a new government should not overturn a decision made by a previous government based on the regulatory review process?
Yes, you did.
All right. Can you give me an example of a project where that actually happened, where the new government overturned a project?
Well, I think we saw that at the Northern Gateway decision, where a project had been approved by the regulator and the previous government, and then was
Assume it's your
overturned.
position that the decision by the current government to overturn the Northern Gateway project has undermined confidence in Canada's regulatory process and our investment environment?
Yes.
All right. You've also suggested that policy debates regarding ongoing climate change and First Nations issues and a few other issues should be dealt with before the assessment process begins. Is that correct?
Yes. So, if there is a decision that we don't want marine traffic on the West Coast, that's a policy decision. That's not part of a regulatory position. If we, for some reason, decide that we don't want energy development in Canada, then that's part of policy decision. That should not be part of a regulatory decision.
Okay, we presently face a real challenge with respect to the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which went through a rigorous regulatory review. After the fact, there was an additional review that was thrown into the mix. It went through that, and at the end of the day, the government made a decision to move forward with the project. It is still facing hurdles. Do you have any words for this committee as to why this is happening?
I think the reason that it's happening is the whole notion that we're running parallel processes. we're running a regulatory process, and because there's a political decision at the end of that process, that parallel process continues. So you've got participation in the regulatory process, that is one layer, but if interests believe that there's something to be gained by continual lobbying and action on the political side, of course they're going to use that process. That only makes sense if that model is built that way.
Is it your opinion that Bill C-69, which is before committee right now, will improve the public's trust and confidence in the regulatory process?
No, because this bill doesn't trust the regulators or the impact assessment committee to make the decisions. So, as I said, why would the public trust a process that, in fact, Bill C-69 doesn't trust?
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Kenyon, in your testimony, you said that you are pleased that the standing test has been removed from the environmental assessment process, correct?
That's correct.
So is it your position that there should be no limitations or parameters on who should have standing to appear during the assessment process?
No, specifically, we wanted to see the standing provision as it was quite limiting. And so it is reasonable to expect that we need to make room in these discussions for those with expertise and knowledge to be able to participate in the process. So obviously, this is not the intent to create a circus by letting everyone into the process. And I think that's actually a really good comment from Mrs. Collins, Dr. Collins. I don't believe that our existing process was expanded enough to allow full discussion.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that you don't want this to turn into a circus, because that is the fear of the investment community, that a process like the one provided for now in Bill C-69 will indeed result in a circus. So you haven't been specific as to what kinds of limitations you would impose in terms of standing.
So there's a couple of really good examples in both. Yeah, thank you. So there's a genuine interest test. So you're able to judge participants from, you have either you're locally involved or you have knowledge on the area, on the project or the area. You're looking for people who actually add value to the discussion. And there's a test on that. There's also a case where, for example, in Alberta with the Alberta Energy Regulator, where they recently were reviewing tailings management plans. And in Alberta, there is quite a restrictive standing test. But they were actually add a provision there to allow genuine interest organizations that had information and knowledge about the tailings issue to come and present knowledge that added to the robustness of their review.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Duncan.
I want to thank all the witnesses here today. Regrettably, in this 800-clause bill, where the government refused to divide it, you are the first witnesses that are talking about this part of the bill. So there's a big onus on you, and I appreciate all the specific proposals for amendment. I got lots of questions. I only have 6 minutes, unfortunately. Professor Banks, great to have you here. Certainly high in my list of recommended witnesses. You've done great work in Alberta. Continue to. My question is quite different than what other people might be looking at it, and it's the part on certificates for designated international power lines. And I know you're probably well aware of the arguments over the Maddle line that went through southern Alberta, which was built for export. And I understand there's still litigation going on and the constitutionality of it, that the NEB did not get involved in that. Do you think that that part of the bill is clarifying? It simply says the Commission may make recommendations that the federal entity might get involved in those approvals. Have you looked at that part of the bill at all?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Duncan. I have looked at that part of the bill, and my recollection was that there were really few, if any, changes from the current provisions of the of the National Energy Board Act. And so I've really got two comments on that. One, that I think that interprovincial transmission lines should be subject to federal regulation. They are not at the moment unless any such project is designated. And I think that's unfortunate, given that we probably need to be strengthening the interprovincial grid as part of
Talking about the
responding
international
to
lines.
And the international, so the international lines are subject to federal regulation, depending upon the proponent's election. So the proponent has this ability to run the project through a provincial permitting system rather than the federal permitting system, which is what happened in the Mattel line, the Manitoba, the Alberta-Montana intertie that you referred to. So you've got this sort of strange combination of federal and provincial regulation, which seems odd to me. It's not what we do for pipelines. It's not clear to me why we've got different rules for transmission lines.
Thank you very much. Really interesting proposals, Pembina, and thank you for picking up on the expert panel recommendations. You are recommending the creation of a public intervener office for the second part of the bill, but should that also apply to the impact assessment process as well?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that is something that we need to consider. It's our opinion that it could be appropriate for thinking about it from a perspective of an energy regulator, so projects that would fall under the energy regulator, but it is something that we do need to think about. When we were proposing it, we were thinking not just about the assessment process, but about the entire life cycle and the number of places that better public participation are needed along the life cycle. So I would say that we think that it could work to use it in the impact assessment for projects that would fall under the CER, but that also would need careful consideration. We wouldn't say that is an absolute requirement, but rather we see it as a value, as a mechanism that could really ensure that we have access and representation all along the entire life cycle of a project.
And I'm noting that Pembina, along with quite a few other interveners, are saying it isn't enough just to say the public can participate and the agency may have rules on costs. You're recommending we need specificity under both of those.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We have had rules around public participation for a long time, but I think what we really need to think about is how we can grow culture and institutional culture that not only allows for public participation, but actually values it and understands that the role that it can play in improving projects. And I just like to also speak to the issue around efficiency, because it is a concern in terms of the volume of participants, and we also think that a public intervener could play a role in that, in terms of potentially creating
intervener office.
Yes, okay. Exactly. In terms of potentially creating classes, grouping groups of citizens together. It's our feeling that,
as is done in Alberta,
right? Yeah. And probably a number of people who intervene in these assessments and in projects don't necessarily need to do it individually. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources. They would be happy to know that their interests are being represented and don't necessarily need to be there in person. So we think it also would improve the efficiency.
I have one more quick question for you. I know you want this question. Do you believe in situ should be included on the project list? Do you believe that there should be extensive public consultation, and do you believe the project list should be in place before we do final reading of this bill?
Yeah, so to be very clear on that, over the past 50 years, the development of the oil sands has, changed the face of Alberta, has driven economic prosperity, but it's also driven massive environmental impacts, from tailings to greenhouse gas emissions. The future of oil sands will be in situ. And if we exclude that type of a project from the list, we are in fact excluding oil sands from being reviewed.
Excluding climate considerations, I guess.
100%.
Thank you very much. Next up would be Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the presenters today. I'm an MP from Newfoundland and Labrador. I live in a riding where the vast majority of the work on offshore oil and gas occurs, where we've built gravity-based structures over the last couple of decades, developed a fairly large offshore oil and gas industry. And of course, the province keeps talking about the potential for the future in terms of offshore oil and gas. And I'm hearing lots of commentary coming back to me from Newfoundland and Labrador, from groups like NOIA, CAP, the province itself, the energy minister, and most of the lobby effort really is concerned about related to the offshore oil and gas in terms of this act and what it's going to do in terms of the future process that people have to follow in terms of public consultation and all these kinds of things. And of course, what they keep talking to me about is if certain parts of this act are not changed or amended, that it's going to mean going to have some dire consequences for offshore oil and gas. And what I'm more interested in today, I guess, is what might be your perspective on this. And I know, for example, on the Atlantic Accord, there are certain stipulations in regards to the offshore petroleum boards that Lisa alluded to. And I just wondered if, Mr. Banks, if maybe you could comment on what do you see as the future role? I know you've talked about it already, of the CNLOPB as regards to their involvement in future development offshore Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly.
Well, I can try, Mr. Rogers, although I suspect both Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Butler might be better placed to answer, because I've principally been looking at Part 2 of the bill dealing with the Canadian Energy Regulator, and the CER will have really no jurisdiction in relation to offshore oil and gas. I mean, it will have a jurisdiction in relation to offshore renewables, and it seems to me that is a positive development for both Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, in that it puts in place a regulatory scheme where there was none before. Whether it's the best scheme, I don't know, but it's good to see that gap addressed. So I think with that, I'm going to defer to my East Coast colleagues, if that's all right.
Thank you. Appreciate the comments. I'll turn to Ms. Mitchell. Maybe you could comment.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity to comment. Clearly, the petroleum boards play an enormous role in the regulation of offshore oil and gas exploration and activity off the coast of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador. We wouldn't see that changing. This is really about how those projects that are on the list of designated projects or activities would be assessed. And the way the Impact Assessment Act changes that is to move those to a review panel process. And the one point that we did make, I think that perhaps is relevant, is that we think that regulators are better placed to advise on that process as opposed to sitting on those review panels.
Thank you very much for that commentary. So under this, I guess, proposed C-69 legislation, Ms. Mitchell, do you see what are particular challenges and opportunities? I know you've talked about some of these things, but specifically to Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. What are some of the challenges you might see that this legislation presents?
You mean the challenges in terms of the development of the offshore?
Yes.
So I guess what I would see, and I'll ask Mr. Butler to comment as well, but what I would see is that we will see for many of the designated activities, and again, we don't know what the designated activities will be. So this is a little bit of an open question, and I think particularly relevant when it comes to the offshore. We don't know if exploratory drilling will be included. We don't know if seismic surveys will be included. We presume production drilling would be included, but we don't know any of that at this stage. We do know that the only way the projects can be assessed is by a review panel. So that indicates to us that there will be a very narrow set of projects assessed, and we would like to see projects that would not necessarily fall into that level, if you will, still being assessed by the Impact Assessment Agency. And maybe Mr. Butler can comment as well.
Yeah, well, I'm not an EA expert. Our attention in Nova Scotia has more focused on what does this mean for other industries out there, such as the fishing industry or the tourism industry, or even some of the new industries that are coming along, like tidal and offshore wind. We recently, I think you might be Othic Energy, there was a proposal for over a $1 billion offshore wind project, which is particularly exciting for the region. So certainly in Nova Scotia, I don't know, I think we've heard less from Newfoundland, but in Nova Scotia, the fishing industry is concerned about the implications of some of these changes and what it might mean for protecting their industry and their competitiveness.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Nope. Sorry, Churns? No. MP Churns? Sorry, MP Churns, you've got 6 minutes and you're done. Sorry. It goes really fast, I know. Thank you. Aisa. Mr. Sopak, please.
Thank you. Dr. Collins, we had testimony from Chris Bloomer, head of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, who described Canada's regulatory environment as a toxic regulatory environment. Very definitive word. A toxin is a poison. As a result of the environment we have now, foreign direct investment in Canada has been estimated going from 2013 at $71.5 billion. It's down 56% now in 2017 to $31.5 billion. As well, a 2017 study ranked Canada 16 out of 17 countries for business investment, compared to 8th place for the period in 2009, 2014. I'll leave it to the people to look at the calendars to realize who was in government at that time. Do you see this decline, Dr. Collins, in investor confidence continuing or even accelerating if the IAA is passed and implemented?
I think the issue is not with impact assessments themselves. Industry wants impact assessments. They want them well defined. What the issue is indeterminate timing, decisions that are politically motivated that happen at 2 points in the process rather than one. And that just creates greater and greater uncertainty.
Yeah, agreed. Having done pipeline assessments myself in the Mackenzie Valley, and that process basically lasted 20 years, and what ended up is with no pipeline. Mr. Kenyon, in very short sentence, maybe one word, are you opposed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Pembina Institute?
I'm not going to answer that with one word. I'm sorry. It's a complex project that needs more than just one word.
Okay. Okay. Many of the activist community have rallied against it. We see colleagues being arrested because of their unlawful activities and so on and so on. But we had a very interesting testimony, and one of the things the activist community is saying, there's not enough consultation and all of that. We had a very interesting testimony from Chief Ernie Cray of the Chin First Nation, and he talked about there are 43 First Nations that have mutual benefit agreements with Trans Mountain, reportedly worth more than $300 million, that offer skills training for employment, business, and procurement opportunities and improvements to local infrastructure. Are those mutual benefit agreements, in your mind, Mr. Kenyon, good things when they provide revenue and training opportunities?
I think the social issues that our Canadian First Nations are facing are huge barriers and huge issues, and I would strongly support a country and government and others to support addressing those issues. I think specifically projects like pipelines or other types of industrial activities, when designed potentially right, can help with that. But I think that there are a whole larger and much more significant suite of issues that need to be addressed.
Of course, in my view, I would let Chief Cray speak for himself. I wouldn't dream of interpreting what he said. I'm reporting what he said. The enthusiasm among his people, his constituents, the anxiousness which they were to get to work. Those are real and specific needs and wants that his community is seeking. And he had a deep understanding as well of foreign direct investment. And I was very, very impressed with his knowledge of the entire Canadian economy and what it means for First Nations like his to participate fully. I would, Mr. Kenyon again, I spent time in the oil sands myself doing environmental assessment work on the Curl project. I assume you've been to the oil sands many times. Do you ultimately want to see oil development and the oil sands phased out? Andrew Weaver, the head of the Green Party, sent out a note yesterday saying that he would like to see the oil sands phased out. Is that your view?
No, the Pembina Institute is a clean energy organization that believes that we have a responsibility to develop our resources responsibly. That's both oil sands and oil and gas, but also our renewable resources. So we are of the opinion that all of these resources must be done responsibly.
And do you think the oil sands are being done responsibly?
I think it's not the case. I think we have a lot of work still to do that, to be able to
I
say
disagree strongly. I did environmental assessment there, and the technology that is being applied is remarkable. Do you, Mr. Kenyon, again, do you support a transition to renewable energy economy?
I support a transition to a diverse energy economy.
I would presume that the renewable sector would have an increasing role to play over time?
I strongly believe that the market actually will determine more of where the energy sector goes, and I think that's actually the fundamental issue that we're facing in this country that we haven't yet woken up to, is that there are market forces that are actually going to impact our existing energy industry, but as well as what's coming down the tank, that's down the road, that could actually dramatically change what is possible for this country.
Well, coming from a renewable energy province myself, Manitoba as one of the leaders in hydroelectricity. And it's interesting, many proponents of renewable energy don't realize how long it'll take. A study by the International Energy Agency, New Policy Scenario 2017, showed that in 24 years of effort and work from 2016 to 2040, there will just be a 6% increase in renewable energy. So we have a long, long way to go on that.
Mr. Sopak, I've got to cut you off,
okay,
unfortunately.
thank you very much.
And we can pick that up on your next questioning section. Mr. Basio.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all today for your presentations, your briefs, and your hard work that you put towards helping us figure out the best way to move forward in this bill. Many of you have spoken about meaningful public participation, and I guess I guess I'd like to hear from each of you. How would you define meaningful public participation in your view? How would that best be represented in this bill?
Are you asking a particular participant?
Yeah, whoever would like to go first, go ahead. I'd like to hear what everyone's got to say on it.
Okay, yes. I am actually going to quote John Sinclair, who has submitted a submission on impact assessment, because he actually has a definition in his submission. Meaningful public participation establishes the needs, values, and concerns of the public, provides a genuine opportunity to influence decisions, and uses multiple and customized methods of engagement to promote and sustain fair and open two-way dialogue. I think that's actually a really good definition. In our written brief, we list a number of components that are required as part of that. So things like access to information, access to expertise, access to legal counsel, access to funding, those sorts of things that are required to enact meaningful public participation.
And would anyone like to add to that?
No, other than clearly a process needs to be established. So an adjudicator's office would be one idea. I mean, there has to be some way to establish exactly which groups have common commentaries, group them together. And we have to, and people need to know in advance what that process is. So that needs to be part of the bill, not part of its culture, but also part of this bill.
Duncan or Mark?
Well, Lisa might be better equipped to answer this question because she studied this longer and deeper than I have. But I would mention to reiterate an earlier point, that I found the public consultation that the EA panel organized to be very respectful, very thoughtful, and quite efficient too. So, Lisa, do you have general comments on?
Sure, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I would interested that Nicole mentioned John Sinclair. John Sinclair and I wrote an article together following our engagement with the Emera Brunswick pipeline substitution process back a number of years ago. And I would say from that, one of the things that we drew that meaningful public participation is when the public members who do seek to participate in a process feel they've been heard. And that they have the opportunity not just to hear what the project is about, but to have an opportunity to actually influence the direction that it might take.
Thank you. Nigel, is there anything you'd like to add that's different from what's already been said?
I don't think so. I think Ms. Dusick really caught the essentials. I guess one thing I would say is that by removing the standing test from Part 2, we are effectively punting to the regulator the responsibility to develop rules which will determine who actually appears. But I think Mr. Kenyon's reference to the genuine interest test is probably a good starting point for those rules.
And do you think that those, rather than punting it down to the regulator, do you think that that definition should actually be embedded within the Act itself?
I think it's probably a good idea not to have it in the Act. It leaves it then organic and capable of changing over time rather than becoming fossilized, which is what we see in some jurisdictions, including my home jurisdiction of Alberta.
Would the rest of you agree with that, or do you think that there should be a clear definition within the Act as to what meaningful public participation should look like?
I won't comment directly on that, but I will say that there is definitely a need for flexibility and for understanding that public participation will look different for different projects. And so in that sense, you know, I don't necessarily see a harm in including a definition of meaningful public participation, but I do think that we need to ensure that what we're legislating makes room for flexibility and adjustment from project to project, so that it's something that can be applied in different circumstances and, as Mr. Banks said, could potentially evolve.
Go ahead, Chair.
Just at 1 minute left.
Okay, Nigel, I wanted to throw this out there as well. I know you talked about the regulator sitting on the IAA and the impact that could have, and I know that the advisory panel originally had said that there shouldn't be any regulators on the panel, and then Rod North yesterday said that, well, actually, you know, we would probably revise it to say you would have one regulator and not be the chair. Would you agree with that that view?
Yes, I would, because I think it's an important perspective and knowledge base that needs to be brought to bear.
But at the same time, communicating that there would be no majority of the regulators on the panel and not the chair.
Correct, and I think I already said that in earlier comments, and I very much support Mr. Kenyon's comments on that.
And I was just going to say, I know that you had commented on that as well. Would you agree with that position?
A couple seconds.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I think there's some specific differences, though, between the CER and potentially the offshore issues. So I think that I reserve that comment for the CER context.
Okie dokie. Next up is Mr. Fast.
Ms. Collins, you heard Mr. Kenyon, I believe most of the other witnesses as well, applaud the elimination of the standing test. Does that improve predictability and certainty in the resource industry?
I don't think it's a question of the standing test alone. I think that an appropriate process to replace the standing test, where that process is well known and understood, is not a problem. I don't think the standing test alone is the issue here.
Okay, so the standing test is being eliminated.
Yes.
Right now it's not officially being replaced with anything.
And it should.
And it should. Okay.
And it should. I mean, you know, what's adding to the uncertainty is the ability for consultation, instead of serving its process of ensuring that people are heard, and have an ability to influence the decision, it has the ability to just become a barrier.
You also talked about, used the word indeterminate timing, I think.
Yes.
You talked about where during the process political decisions are made. Can you be more specific about the concerns you have about the timing of these political decisions that get made throughout the process?
Right. So there's two issues. There's one of the actual timeline allotted for each of the phases, and especially in the front end, there's a lot of room where it's this many days, and it can be extended from 90 days to another 90 days to another, kind of ad infinitum. So, there should be less ability to extend the process in terms of timing. Overall, this timing's longer than what we currently experience in most cases. And then there's the notion of where the decisions are made, the go, no-go decisions are made.
Bill C-69 significantly expands the factors that must be considered in coming to a decision on any particular project, including the impact that the project will have on Canada's greenhouse gas emission targets. Do you believe that that expanded list of factors is going to improve the process, slow down the process? What is the impact that will have on resource projects in Canada?
I don't actually think the expanded factors is an issue, because right now they're looking at expanded factors. And I think that's been the issue so far, is that the scope has not been clear of what's required in this process. So de facto, these processes currently are looking at a broader range of issues rather than just the specific environmentals. They are looking at social and cultural and other issues as well.
Are there other provisions in Bill C-69 which you believe undermine Canada's competitiveness in the resource sector?
Like I said, rigorous assessment is not I don't think is unwelcome. Canada right now is one of the most rigorous assessment processes in the world. The challenge is the implementation of that process and what that means. It's the fact that decisions are revisited and revisited and revisited makes it impossibility for anyone to make an investment decision.
Mr. Kenyon, just a couple of minutes ago, you made a statement. I'm paraphrasing. I hope I don't have you wrong, but I'd like some comments on what you meant by it. There are much larger issues at play than First Nations participating in pipeline projects.
There's much larger issues that First Nations are facing in this country, from social, economic issues. That's what I'm referring to there. No reference to the pipeline issue.
So you don't believe that economic opportunity is a big issue for First Nations?
I absolutely entirely believe that economic opportunity is a great part of it. So, for example, Pembina Institute is working with northern First Nation communities who are looking at bringing energy self-sufficiency to their communities. We've been running this process for 3 years. We had 200 people at a conference in Yellowknife discussing this, and Whitehorse in the last 2 years. This is about empowering and enabling First Nations to choose their own direction when it comes to energy, as well as economic and social self-sufficiency.
All right. We had Mr. Ernie Cray here. My colleague, Mr. Sopak, referred to his testimony. He highlighted the fact that the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project represents significant, very significant economic opportunity. And yet we have groups in British Columbia and across the country who are opposing the pipeline basically on for ideological reasons. I think earlier you mentioned that you believe that it's not only wind energy and solar energy and other alternative clean energy that must be considered. You talked about the whole mix of energy generation in Canada, and we have to look at it in a holistic way. If you could expand a little bit on what you meant by that.
So we're at a nexus point globally when it comes to energy. We're at a point where we have revolutionary new technologies for extracting gas and oil through hydraulic fracturing. We also have revolutionary technologies coming from renewables and batteries and emerging technologies that when we're going to be, my children will have things that we never had in terms of options for energy. I think what we're struggling with in this country is where our current economy is based on and how we make that transition possible without leaving ourselves behind and leaving a lot of people behind, because in all fairness, there's a lot of people in this country that absolutely make a good living from our economy and our energy sector. What really I think we need to be debating, instead of particular projects, is where is this country going when it comes to energy and how we adapt. And I'm seeing a red card, which usually gets me trumped off the field.
Well, it's a 1 minute over. I've been incredibly generous, so
you want me to tear off my jersey?
No,
and have a
you're all
temper
good. Thank you. Mr. Amos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to start by setting the record straight, at least on the Coral Oil Sands project, and perhaps Mr. Kenyon would have comments in this regard. I appreciate that Mr. Sopak did environmental assessment work for the proponent on that file. I believe it was Imperial. And my understanding is that went to federal court, and the panel decision was overturned, and the panel decision was one that approved the project. So I'm not sure what the subsequent developments were in that. I would expect it may have been appealed further, but my understanding was that the Canadian courts found significant problems, and really what this brings us to is actually, I think, a helpful kind of thought process. We're trying to fix proceedings that aren't working for the environment and for Canadians. So I wonder if you could comment on that, Mr. Kenyon.
See, Nigel or Mr. Banks, I was actually, I don't remember the specifics of that, to be honest. It predates my day in the discussions on oil sands. I think significantly, though, when we look at the role for us to review bad decisions or potentially in mistakes in the decisions. So, for example, in the Northern Gateway decision, that was the case where the courts actually found that there was not proper consultation with First Nations. It was not actually a political decision. It was actually about a justice issue. So I'd like to point that out. And Nigel, sorry, Mr. Banks, if you'd like to comment on Curl specifically.
So I can try and do that. My recollection of Curl is that it was a case brought by Pembina, and yes, it did result in the review going back to the panel, and it rectified the omissions in its assessment.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate also the clarification that the Northern Gateway decision was not a political one; it was a judicial one. In any event, I'll move on because I think that there's more evidence that should be put on the record in relation to achieving clarity around the decision-making criteria. For a cabinet decision, there have been a number of interventions by several witnesses, several organizations who are seeking a very specific, more specificity in relation to what the proper basis of a cabinet decision should be on. Obviously, that would enable the courts, if they are to do their job at a subsequent stage of evaluating the reasonableness of such a decision. And I appreciate this is sort of a direction that the West Canada Foundation has led us in. But I'd like to direct this to Mr. Banks in particular. What is your assessment of the public interest test and the criteria that have been that are attached?
Well, I think that is a very interesting question, and it's interesting to look at the differences between the IAA legislation and the CER legislation. So for the CER legislation, what we have now is an expanded list of the criteria that are found in the National Energy Board Act. I think that that expanded list does clarify. In fact, it largely, I think, reflects the practice of the board, which has been to take into account a broader range of considerations. What's missing in the CER legislation is any specific reference to climate change, and we've already discussed that. But I think what's more interesting, actually, is the direction given to the Governing Council in the CER legislation, because the CER legislation is completely silent on that question. It doesn't tell us how the Cabinet is to be making those decisions. By contrast, under the IAA legislation, there are 3 or 4 specific considerations that the Minister or the Governing Council must direct their minds to. And so one of the things I say in my brief is that why aren't we following that same approach in the context of the CER? In other words, giving Cabinet more explicit direction and then, as you say, making it possible to have a more objective review of that decision by a court if necessary. And that adds to, I think, transparency, accountability, and public trust.
I appreciate that comment. I would agree that some criteria to put a frame around cabinet decision making is entirely appropriate and certainly better than none. And I think that I'll invite the other witnesses to engage on this one, because what we've been told is that the criteria that have been advanced for the impact assessment aspect, they themselves are not specifically. They're not specific enough and clear enough, and they don't really put enough of a framework around it. So perhaps if the Pembina Institute would be willing to comment, I know this is an issue that your organization has focused on in the past.
Yes, so in our written brief, we did make a recommendation along those lines. The factors that we thought would be important to consider would be climate impacts, Indigenous rights and impacts on Indigenous peoples, as well as public input. We would like to see that included in a factor that or a parameter around a decision that goes into making a decision. I agree with the critiques that perhaps what's in the Impact Assessment Act don't go far enough, but what we are asking for in the CER Act is basically to at the very least, have something that somehow mirrors that, so that we can avoid the situation where we have decision statements that say we considered it and we made our decision, and they don't actually explain how things were considered, to what extent they were considered, what factors were weighed in.
I'm going to have to cut it there, if you don't mind. Okay, next up is Ms. Duncan. And you're going to get 6 minutes. Okay.
So much to talk about, so little time, but I really appreciate everybody's input, particularly the fact that you are also talking about the CER, because it's insane that we're also reviewing that act. We don't even report to that minister. One of the things that I think that has been left confused, and I think that probably Professor Banks can speak to this, and also a representative from East Coast Environmental Law, is there seems to be confusion about the expert panel recommended a tribunal, okay? Permanent tribunal as opposed to ad hoc appointments to a panel. And I think people are getting confused about that permanent tribunal versus judicial review. So I think it would be good for maybe the lawyers who are testifying to us to explain that those are 2 totally different things. And I think one of the reasons why the expert panel recommended a permanent tribunal I can relate to, because I'm from Alberta and we're used to a permanent energy review panel. And so they are people who are used to people coming forward. They're used to sitting down with participants and saying, can you get together with those other groups and combine and hire one lawyer and one engineering expert? The problem is with this bill, nobody ever knows how the project's going to be reviewed. It may never be reviewed at all as a result of the so-called planning process. It may be reviewed by the agency. It may be reviewed by some sort of panel. And it's not really clear what the participation rights are under any of those. So I think there is a need for clarification. If there are participation rules, those should apply across the board, including probably to the CER. The there have been a couple of suggestions, some that they be actually put in the statute. On the other hand, is actually under the regulation power by the cabinet, that the cabinet be required to issue regulations which state those rights. One thing that I would point out, and I'd be interested in people to comment, under the Environmental Cooperation Agreement to NAFTA, Canada long ago signed on to deliver for the rights before tribunals, the right to present evidence, the right to cross-examine. So it is odd that none of this is in there. I'm troubled with the suggestions of throwing in something like an adjective, meaningful participation, and then feeling that there's a need to define what's meaningful participation, because then you're cutting off the opportunity to actually have clear guidelines of what the rights are. So I would appreciate some feedback on that and who you think best should decide what those participation rights should be and what the access to costs should be. Where should those be laid out? Anybody like to comment on that?
3 minutes there. Answer that. Very complicated answer. Go ahead. Who's up first?
Somebody talk. Clock is ticking.
The time's running out, yes.
Okay, I'll ask another question. I noticed that UNDRIP, that Pembina has recommended that UNDRIP be specifically referenced. We did have a number of other First Nation leaders appear. We're having more, and each one of them seem to be echoing what you're saying, is that UNDRIP should be specifically referenced. But one thing that you might want to clarify, one of the concerns some people have raised is this bill C-69 appears to be premised on the conservative reiteration of SIA, not the original iteration. That's where there's some confusion. The conservative iteration of SIA was that the decision is by cabinet, not by the panel. So I find it puzzling that the Conservatives are raising this concern in this bill, that the decision was left to the political level. So in other words, it's the same.
You have another chance.
It's the
same. She has the floor. You have a chance.
You didn't used to be that way. They introduced that. So what do you think? Do you think the final decision on the major project should be by the review panel, or do you think the final decision should be by the political level? Nigel?
I guess I think that's a political decision.
Yeah. Well, anybody else want to comment? Do you like the way SIA was before, or did you like it under the Conservative regime? Which way should it go?
Well, I guess I'm focusing more directly on the CER legislation, and I think so. The decision should be a political decision, but as we've just talked about with Mr. Amos, there should be some guidance provided. There should be reasons given by cabinet or the minister, and that decision should be reviewable by a court. So I'm not just saying political and therefore anything goes. It's political within those constraints.
Thanks. I would like to hear a little bit more about those two recommendations by Pembina, including the Canadian Energy Information Agency and the rationale for why that is critical.
Yeah, so what we've recommended is basically a two-part. There's two functions that we're looking at when we're looking at energy information. And the reason that this is important is because good decision-making has to be based on good data, and it has to be based on high-quality data that is bias-free. And so what we have suggested is expanding the role of Stats Canada in terms of its energy collection or energy data collection capacities, utilizing what their existing expertise, and then to create a separate body, a small body housed under NRCan that would do analysis. That said, I will say that there are a lot of different proposals out there for how this could be organized, and rather than actually being wed to any particular institutional structure, really what we want to see is energy data collection and analysis separated from both regulatory and policy functions.
Very much. I have to cut you off there. My apologies. Mr. Sopak.
Yes. Just for the record, the Northern Gateway was killed by a political decision after a rigorous process. And for Mr. Amos's benefit, here's a picture of the Curl project. The project passed all the reviews and was built and is generating jobs and income for Albertans and all of Canada. Mr. Butler or Ms. Mitchell, the Ecology Action Centre, I would presume that biodiversity conservation is in your wheelhouse in terms of the activities that you do? Yeah, good. Renewable energy is being developed off the East Coast at a fairly rapid rate. I'm thinking in terms of wind energy and also tidal energy. Is that a fair comment?
At Tidal, they're working hard on it. There's some challenges, but I'm hopeful. I think it's an incredible resource. We also have a major offshore wind opportunity in the form of Beothic Energy. They have the European capital to move ahead, but I understand there's been some obstacles, not from environmentalists, but perhaps from our provincial utility in terms of hooking up to the grid.
Well, I just to clear the record up, I'm a fisheries biologist by training, and I have a lot of difficulty with tidal energy and wind energy. The environmental problems with tidal and wind are always glossed over. So, for example, in Ontario, every year there's over 41,000 bat deaths caused by wind turbines, 14,000 bird deaths, and 462 raptor deaths. And in terms of the bats, 3 of them are SARA-listed species under the Endangered Species Act. But it seems that wind energy gets away, and all renewable, they get away from any environmental assessment whatsoever. I mean, it's in the Minister of Environment's mandate to enforce the Species at Risk Act, yet nobody is. And at the same time, the Ontario government ran roughshod over local communities in Ontario and eliminated their right of appeal in terms of assessing wind turbines, wind project developments. So, Mr. Butler or Ms. Mitchell, should renewable energy projects be subject to the Impact Assessment Act when it's passed?
That's an interesting question, and I wondered if somebody was going to bring it up. I mean, I would say yes. So, siting is obviously important, whatever you're talking about, and but yeah, we recognize too with renewable energy that it's addressing a serious problem we have, which is climate change. We've just come out of a winter in Nova Scotia where we've had more storms and more damage to coastal infrastructure, including roads and wharves. And the cost of that it's really starting to mount.
But shouldn't the provisions of the Species at Risk Act be brought in to assess wind turbines? They're getting away scot-free. I mean, I'm a birder myself, and we have bats in our community and on our farm, and we enjoy these species immensely. And the mortality rate is astonishing, yet it gets a free pass. Why is that?
I don't know if it's getting a free pass. I think we're hearing more about it, and too many in the wrong place. I'm a birder too. I know that some habitat loss is the top impact on birds, and actually the 2 top causes of direct mortality for birds are cats and windows, which you wouldn't think, but it's actually true. Over 300 million birds are killed each year by cats in Canada. So sometimes when people complain about wind turbines and birds, even though they have some profile in their community, they often need to look in their own backyard.
Cats don't kill raptors or bats. So I've heard that excuse before, and I don't buy it for a minute. In terms of tidal energy, what does the Ecology Action Centre, what have you learned about the impacts on fish populations?
I wrote about this 25 years ago. I've been following it. I think in-stream, rather tidal barrages across rivers, like the Annapolis one, has clearly killed fish. It kind of slices and dices them. I think in-stream holds a lot more potential, and it's tough though, because you've got it's really hard to study and it's really hard to monitor, particularly in the Bay of Fundy where you have the water's moving at 3 or 4 knots. I actually think we're going to find a way to develop tidal which will have a relatively small impact given the overall biomass on fish.
Well, given that, Mr. Kenyon talks about the move to renewables, should there be, and you're saying it could do better over time, but there's existing renewable energy projects going in place right now, should they be subject to rigorous environmental assessment?
Well, I know that...
and community approval.
The answer is yes, no project should get a free pass, but tidal is getting more scrutiny and more attention, I think, than any other energy development has ever gotten, both because on the technical side we have to figure lots of things out, but also because there's concern from fishermen about the impacts, and we have concerns. I mean, if we start finding harbor porpoises chopped up on the beach, or...
We'll be happy.
or, sea bass or whatever, then we will have a problem. So far, we haven't been able to determine that there's a major problem with in-stream tidal.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Amos. Last questioner.
Thank you. How much time? 6 minutes?
You have 6 minutes.
Thank you. So today we have not discussed to any extent the issue of federal provincial collaboration in assessments, the issue of the appropriateness of substitution, the terms upon which equivalency is determined. And I wanted to open this up particularly to Professor Banks and Pembina. I want to hear your views on how that is most appropriately done. And I think that we've fortunately or unfortunately, we've entered a very politicized environment around the Trans Mountain issue, which has sort of framed up the question. But I think that we need to take a step back from that and just look more broadly at how do we really want a coherent federal provincial assessment regime to function. That's what I'm thinking about now, so I'd love to hear your views on that.
Well, I'm going to let Mr. Kenyon start.
Thanks, Nigel. Ironically, I'm living and breathing some of the equivalency issues right now, for example, with the federal methane regulations and the provincial methane regulations. So the equivalency piece is something that is quite lacking in terms of the clarity, in terms of what will be the judgment for that. I'm not as strong to be able to speak about that in the environmental assessment context, but I believe that there is some very strong principles and guidance that needs to be established to be able to make that really clear as to how equivalency works. And also quite critically, when we're looking at the federation or how our country works, we really want to be able to be clear about creating collaboration and processes that encourage the federal government and the provincial governments to work together. I think that the more that we discourage that type of work, the more territorial we have a chance to get. And specifically on projects like, when we're starting to deal with some pretty large energy projects or some politicized aspects, you can see how that can take away from the spirit of collaboration that needs to be established.
So maybe I'll jump in with just 2 comments. One, we should clearly be trying to avoid duplication in review. That's inefficient. I don't think it's in anybody's interest. But second, I think we have to recognize that even where we've got a federally regulated project like Trans Mountain, that there will be a legitimate provincial interest. And I think that provincial interest doesn't amount to a veto, that the province is not in a position to undermine a federal approval, but that the process has to be able to take into account legitimate provincial and municipal concerns. It actually seems to me that the Kinder Morgan review process did that. Condition number 1 of Trans Mountain certificate is that it's obliged to live by provincial and municipal permits. I think that the challenge has been that Trans Mountain has found that Burnaby has not been acting in good faith in terms of proceeding with the permitting processes. So I think that's really all. I haven't really thought that much about the substitution issues, to tell you the truth, Mr. Amos.
Thank you for that. And I'm certainly, in a sense, I feel like I'm also signaling to other witnesses to come and to our own government and to my colleagues that I'm really looking for. I'm looking for a stronger regime around the determination of equivalency, because in my estimation, a system of determining equivalency that is premised solely on unfettered discretion is not the direction to go. I totally agree with the idea that we want one assessment, we want collaborative federalism, so the governments are working together on environmental assessments, but that can't be achieved through unilateral, unfettered discretion to simply say the provincial assessment is equivalent to what is required under federal law. So what I'm looking for in the future is some real guidance on that. I signal that to our witnesses today and to others who may be paying attention to these hearings.
You have 1 minute, Will.
Oh, do I?
You done? Or
I'll hand that time off to my colleague, Mr. Bossio, as he may have another question. If not,
and I'll take it and
I'll
use
give it to the chair. Maybe the chair has a question.
You
no, it's okay. Go ahead.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah.
So if I could have the forbearance of the panel, I would want to do just a bit of administrative. And I know that if I suspend, the time all goes to everybody coming up and having a chat with you, because I know that they'll be interested in that. I want to thank each of you for taking the time to come. You've given us a lot to think about. You've helped us drill down on some of the concerns that we've had. So just if you wouldn't mind just staying with us for a few minutes, I just want to do some administrative and some suggestions for the committee. So I wanted to first acknowledge and recognize our clerk for the hard work that he's been doing, trying to get all the panels coordinated. We have 2 panels on Tuesday. We have 2 more panels on Wednesday and 1 panel. So next week's going to reflect this week, so that everybody understands what we're trying to work towards. We've had, that will be, out of the 48 that we asked, only 5 declined. We have 1 we're still waiting to get a response from, and then we'll have all our spaces full as a result of that. We have over 150 briefs that have come in, and they are working their way as fast as possible through translation. So we appreciate all of the hard work that you've done to try and make this work successfully. It's been a good week, adding to the previous weeks of testimony. I wanted to just, I know our analysts have been busy trying to figure out how to help us, and they've given us some reports to assist, and they have some thoughts on maybe where we might want to look at some things. Yes?
We dismiss the witnesses?
No, I just went through that. I was going to ask their forbearance to just stand by for a minute, because then we'll end the meeting. Exactly. So I just wanted, that's why I mentioned that. We'll just quickly do the details, if you can have your forbearance for a minute, because I know people are going to want to come up and talk to you. Yes. Well, after we're finished. Oh, you want to go now? You can go now if you want.
I'm being
okay,
sad.
because I know the members will want to talk to you right after. So please go ahead.
No, just want to take the opportunity to point out that I've prepared a note regarding some of the potential issues that could be raised by Indigenous groups. That note has been distributed to you on Monday. So there's a bit of background on Indigenous rights and some of the potential issues. So if you have additional questions, you can ask, and I'll try to answer. There's 3 things. There's protection of Indigenous rights and the non-derogation clause that was raised also earlier this week. Yeah. Specific issues regarding treaties obligations. The Crees have pointed out some of them. And implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Right of the Indigenous People. That was also discussed this week. So I don't know if we have additional Indigenous groups that are coming, but...
Yeah, we do. Yep. So we do have Indigenous groups still coming before us. So we did have some very detailed testimony this week. So it'll be really good to review what our analysts have prepared for us. And I think that's it. I will end and wish everyone a good weekend, and we'll be back at it again next Tuesday. Thank you.